So the last video that I made was a little bit about democratic theory and how the process has worked in the United States over the last couple of election cycles. And I contended that rather than living in a high functioning democracy, which is what all of the United States internally produced propaganda would tell you. Like, for example, if you look at any of those rankings of democratic freedoms and all this kind of stuff, like Freedom House or any of the UN rankings or whatever, it's going to say that the United States is one of the freest countries in the world. Now, it may be true that civil rights are protected in the United States to a degree that we don't see in other countries, but I would argue that the connection between those freedoms and democracy is perhaps not as strong as we might think it is. It might simply be the case that the people in the United States think that they're living in a democracy and therefore expect a high level of civil rights, and that if the oligarchic elite in the United States does not provide a high level of civil rights, then the citizens in the United States would violently overthrow the government and murder all of the political elites that they could get their hands on. I think that's probably what would happen. But instead, we've got what appears to be kind of like a phony democracy, a faux democracy, an oligarchy with these trappings of democracy. But I wanted to read some of the comments from the last video and make some clarifications and expand on a couple of points that I thought would be relevant. So Paul wrote, we'll go to the end first and then back up. He said, "The system works, so be careful before you disregard it. You will get oligarchy in its place and with all its flaws." And so, my argument is that that's actually what we have. We've got an oligarchy with enough of the features of democracy to where the public is basically fooled and more or less, comfortable with what they're getting. You could imagine a system in which the candidates run on their campaigns, the people go and vote, everybody fundraises, they do all that stuff, and at the end of the day, there is a deep state conspiracy that takes all of the vote totals from the election and throws them in the wastebasket, and then just comes up with new ones for a certain candidate that they have already pre-selected. Clearly, I think that is not the case, because Donald Trump did get elected despite basically every establishment political figure in the entire United States trying to keep him from getting elected. So I don't think it goes quite that far. But the 2012 stuff with Ron Paul and the 2016 stuff with Bernie Sanders clearly show that at the level of the party elites, those processes are not democratic. Now, another comment that Paul had here in this paragraph is that he says he would have more sympathy for my point if Paul and Sanders were not both crackpots. And then he gives some criticisms of both candidates and says that Ron Paul, for instance, was unsound outside of the economic stuff. It's not the purpose of a democratic system to a priori judge which candidates are reasonable or unreasonable before it puts those candidates to the voter. The function of the democratic system is, let's back up for just a second. In the French Revolution, there was a figure in the early part of the French Revolution, the intellectual foment that led up to it. There was a fellow that I've mentioned before on this channel called the Marquis de Condorcet. Condorcet was a polymath. He was, one of these people who was an astronomer and a mathematician, an early statistician and a political theorist and all this kind of stuff, right? That's how people used to be before everything got super specialized and professionalized. You could be active in more than one field and make original contributions, and not very many people can do that today. De Condorcet argued that democracy works because it pools the intellectual capacity of a large number of people, and in the same way that a jury works in a trial, if we get 12 people together and we ask them a question, and they're all just marginally more likely to be right than they are to be wrong, then if we pool a bunch of those people, we ask them the question, and then we take the answer that comes out of that group, we're more likely to get it right than if we just go ask one person. So what Condorcet was reacting to would be this elite kind of system, like a monarchy or an aristocracy, in which you might have a king or a judge, let's say, with an IQ of 140. Now, they're more educated and they have a higher cognitive ability than the average person, but they're still capable of getting something wrong because it's just one guy and he might be wrong. If we use the jury theorem method, we're going to go and we're going to get 12 people, let's say, who are of sound mind, and even if their IQs are only 100 and they're each 51%, they're each likely to be right at an expectation of 51%, and we get 12 of them, we ask them all the same question, and 7 or 8 of them answer one way, and then 4 or 5 answer the other way. If we go with the most common answer, we're more likely to be right. That's basically the Condorcet jury theorem and the argument against elitism that would have been coming out of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment and people like Condorcet. So the whole underpinnings of democracy are this kind of idea. It's that you're not going to put your faith in the elite, you're going to put it in the people. So we don't have to, and we should not be assessing Ron Paul or Bernie Sanders on the basis of their ideological credibility. We merely have to put them in front of the voters and see what happens. Now, many times, Democratic theorists have a serious problem with Weimar Germany because Adolf Hitler and the NSDAP were democratically elected. The German people freely chose to elect that group of people and put them in power. So this creates a problem for democratic theory. They have to come up with all kind of post hoc explanations. They got to play the blame game. They got to start pointing fingers all over the place because this seems to be an acceptable outcome from democratic theory. And it seems like in the post-war period, the elites have been anti-populist and anti-nationalist to the detriment, to the suffering of democratic theory. So they've not even been very shy about throwing the democratic theory stuff to the wind. To the extent that they want to restrict the kind of candidates and the kind of ideologies that actually get put to the voter. Whereas if you really were a serious Democrat, a serious populist, a serious believer in the ability of the people to choose the right thing, on average, to use the law of large numbers to help find the right way forward, you wouldn't need to do any of that stuff. So that would be my response to that particular critique, is that if you really believe in democracy, you've got to let these people run naturally, you've got to let the ideas go out there, and you've got to let the public pick what they want. And you might not get what you want, and you might not even end up with democracy, but that's the way that the system has to work. You can't come up with all of these fixes, just because the system isn't working the way that you want it to or that you would expect it to. Now, Mr. Coolmug posted a recommendation that I watch a video about fourth generation warfare and the end of the Westphalian Order by William S. Lind. I had seen that name before, and I had heard on Myth of the 20th Century, I believe it was Nick Mason was talking about fourth generation warfare. It's a very good video. I would recommend watching the whole thing because it's like a 30 or 45 minute panel, and William S. Lind's talk is the middle part of that. So I'd watch the whole thing if you can afford the time to do so. And I think his comments there about legitimacy are particularly useful. He's talking about how shit just doesn't work right in the United States, either from the military angle or the socio-political angle, because the people in the United States know that the establishment is not responsive to the popular will, and that kind of like undermines our interest in serving the state, which therefore makes the state weak, which therefore makes all of the money that we spend on the state a waste of money. So it's actually very concise, very theoretically powerful, very parsimonious, and I would recommend that everybody go watch that if you already hadn't. And I'm sad that I haven't seen it until recently. So thank you, Mr. Coolmug, for that. And thank you, Paul, too, for your comments as well. Next up, we've got my Croat friend, Bornatona. He says people under IQ 120 shouldn't be allowed to vote, but who wants that? Ruler class, certainly not. I can't argue with that. I really can't. If we only had people voting who were 120 IQ and over, the elites would be absolutely screwed, because there are a lot of people out there with an IQ of 120. Millions upon millions upon millions of people. And the people who have an IQ of 120 or over are able to follow logic. Okay, they can detect whether an argument is logically valid if they sit down and look at it. They're able to understand critical analysis. They're able to look at data. And basically, all of the propaganda would go out the goddamn window if only people with 120 IQ were allowed to vote. And the good thing with the 120 IQ stuff also is that, let's say you have a family, you got 5 or 6 people, you might have one person with an IQ there of 120, and they're not going to vote to gas the rest of their family members or send them off to the gulag or something like that. So the good thing about cognitive elitism is that it cuts across a lot of other cleavages. For instance, if you go to a big urban center, you might have more people per capita who are over an IQ of 120, but it's not going to be so far over the rural areas. In some cases, it may be actually less than rural areas. But at any rate, I am not immediately opposed to that idea, because, as he says, it would actually scare the shit out of the elites. He says, America will never be great again. It's over, done, ended. I mean, we'll have to wait and see, right? I certainly don't think that without a political overthrow or revival that anything's going to change. We're on a long, slow downward trajectory, and I don't really see anything changing anytime soon. He says America promoting democracy as a Trojan horse to make countries weaker. Yeah, basically promoting so-called democracy. I don't know if it's necessarily to make them weaker, because who they really want to weaken would be like China and Russia, because those are the main adversaries, or contenders for power, you'd have to say. So I think that they're promoting democracy as a means to control strategic locations like Georgia, or other, like countries that may not be fully westernized. So then they can use this so-called democratization as a way to get control of these strategic areas. Ukraine, the America really isn't promoting democracy in Ukraine. They're just promoting westernization so that they can control the country better. Give me just a second. Sorry, I got interrupted for about an hour with some work stuff. Okay, Bornatona's last comment, he says, America promoting democracy as a Trojan horse to make countries weaker. I think I covered that. He said it isn't about democracy, it's about control. USA, the Jews, in parentheses, have done a lot of shit across Central Europe. Yeah, the Judeo-Zionist agenda, which I think any sane person has to believe that is the major driving force behind U.S. foreign policy, has done a lot of shit across Central Europe, and it is to the extent that that is driving the U.S.-Russia relationship, which heavily influences what's going on in Central Europe. I'm not really sure. It seems to be that there's two groups in American foreign policy, and I have to thank the Tim Kelly program. I can't remember who his co-host was. It may have been the Collins twins, but they basically said, and I think they're right, that there's two groups in U.S. foreign policy. One is the globalist people, which would be like the Clintons, like Zbigniew Brzezinski, the George Soros types, Henry Kissinger, just all those kind of people. That's the globalist group. And, you know, they're kind of like, they're not against Israel per se, but their basic goal, this would be the Rockefellers, their basic goal is the world government kind of stuff. And then the other group, which has been in the ascendant before and after the Obama administration, is the neocons. And their entire goal seems to be to use the power of the United States to protect Israel. So I think if I had to say that the antics of the United States in Central Europe is probably more about the globalist side of things than the Zionist side of things. And then we got spoiler alert. Let's see here. He quotes something I said, and then he says, as far as mulling what might or might not offer a more democratic process of social choice, some of the most intelligent and motivated people have studied this and arrived at hundreds of results and ideas. It is apparently a very difficult problem, even in the agreement on definitions of the will of the people, quote unquote. Mix in herd behavior and Arrow's impossibility theorem. Very good observation there, very important. Hadn't been considering, I haven't heard about that in years, but it's definitely relevant. One thing is clear, however, and that is the legacy media is used to undermine certain public consensuses while bolstering and even creating others, all to the benefit of a very small and mysterious group of masters. That's exactly right. So my critique with the original, the first video was to say that to the extent that the party elites and the media and the bureaucracy, for instance, or the funders, the fundraisers, to the extent that all of those people have a conspiracy against the voter, and to the extent that they are able to put their plans into place, which it seems like usually they're pretty effective in doing, there's not a lot of room left. There's not a lot of room left for democracy to work like it's said to work. And that doesn't even account for Arrow's impossibility theorem. It doesn't count. It doesn't include the jury theorem, or even whether there's a Condorcet winner amongst certain policies. If you want to look that up too, it doesn't even deal with any of that. Throw all that stuff out. We're not talking about the institutions here. We're just talking about, is the system able to function as it's intended to function? So this is even a prior problem than this other stuff. So thank you guys for your comments. This is a fundamental question for us, and it might be useful to pursue this with your everyday people, with your family members and your friends, because we're going to have to undermine people's belief in the American democratic system in order to get anything better out of it. In order to overthrow or to reform or to do anything worthwhile, we've got to show people that the stuff that they're currently trusting is actively trying to destroy them, and it's controlled by people who aren't interested in following the rules. There's a reason why somebody with a joint in their sock goes to jail, and Hillary Clinton, for instance, is a free woman. Thank you for your time.